Sorry, if I may, through the chair, just in response to that, when our staff give advice to local boards, which we do for all funding recommendations, for example, we always make sure that our advice is framed in the context of the Auckland plan and the organisational priorities, as well as responding to the local board priorities. So, I guess where we're sitting, we definitely see that we're serving the organisation as a whole, which includes governing body and local boards, and looking to work towards a cohesive strategic direction in the advice that we provide.
Thank you. Councillor Watson, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Graham and Christine, for your work on this. My question just goes to this little section, what is meant by an enabling council, and I see there's, in particular, there's a reference to requiring a change in processes and attitudes, and I think one of the other councillors alluded to it earlier. In a situation where a community wants to do something, and theoretically or legally, they could be liable for 3 years imprisonment and $100,000 fine, which is actually what some groups are being told when they're looking to do something pretty basic. In this instance, it was just using a weed eater, essentially. That was what. So what really concerns me is that on a practical level, that the change in attitude, or the enabling part of the equation of enabling the communities, is a little less certain as to what approach could be taken in any given circumstance where, yes, all these terrible things could happen, but really it's a pretty straightforward task, and let's have common sense prevail. How do we get past that situation? Is it just purely by a far more definitive directive in terms of attitude, or do you have some other idea?
Through the chair, I think the Enabling Council initiative is about exactly that. It's about you can't have an empowered community without a council that is supporting and enabling them to do what they want to do, and it's so the initiative is about how do we drive a culture change across the whole of council. Culture change doesn't happen overnight. It's a process, and that's why the initiative is a 3-year initiative. But there are also live situations happening right now. We have 2 roles in our practice team whose title is Specialist Advisor Council Enablement. So their role is to pick up those issues exactly like the one you mentioned, and to work with the other parts of council to try and find solutions. And I know in the weed eater example, it took a long time, but we did get a solution in the end. Hopefully as the initiative picks up, we'll be able to get those solutions a lot more quickly. And so I guess it's a twofold thing. It's about taking individual issues now, and it's also about having a more strategic overview that says how are we going to change the culture across council.
Thank you. Councillor Fulapana.
Thank you, Chair. When the whole empowerment communities approach was adopted, there were some local boards that weren't very supportive of it. What are you now finding around the feedback and communication with the local boards? I mean, there must be a feel now around, yes, we still don't support it because of these issues, or look, it's actually, now that it's been slowly implemented, it's actually working for the areas. So I just invite a comment on that, please.
Sure. Through the chair. So we did quite an extensive piece of seeking feedback from the local boards for this report, and you'll see we've themed in the that part of the report, we've themed the feedback. There were some local boards that felt it was too soon to give feedback. Generally, the sense was, I think, in terms of the theming, the support of the strategic brokers was unanimous from every local board. They, you know, possibly a concern about the breadth of the role of the strategic broker, but very supportive, and concerns around the transition process and the issue that was mentioned earlier around actually, you know, the issues that we're facing as a local board are across council, and so this needs to be a whole of council thing, not just a unit over there. And yeah, so I think it's still early days, but I think we have made good progress. The other theme I think that came through was we know our strategic broker because, you know, we see them and we see what they're doing, but we're not so clear about the role and the work of the practice hub. So I think that's a good challenge for our unit to look at how we can make the work of the practice hub a lot more transparent and visible to local boards. I think the feedback was good because it gave us some key areas to focus on, and yeah, I think we've made progress.
Cool. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Quacks.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wonder, is this document, is this part of the council record? Will this be part of the council record?
Well, I'm not quite sure what you mean by the council record, but it's a document that we've pulled together, sorry, through the chair to look to simplify our communication of what the Empowered Communities approach is about, and as a reference material for staff primarily. So it's an internal staff reference document.
Well,
It'll be part of the minutes.
Yeah, okay. Well then, so I'm somewhat troubled by the comments under treaty partnership that Maori have historically experienced exclusion from local government. That's not true in all cases, and I think it's a very broad brush approach to take. And if I look back at the Legacy Manukau Council in my last term there, I think we had 3 Maori members on that. So I wonder if it would be more useful to be a little bit more positive in our comments about the effort that this council is making to include Maori, mana whenua, in local government and the process through the Independent Maori Statutory Board, through the co-governments partnerships that we have, rather than perhaps dwelling on negatives. Perhaps it would be more appropriate to look at what we're doing well rather than what historically some councils have not been able to achieve, or some Maori have not been able to achieve by getting themselves elected onto councils. Is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think that, well, that can, what would you,
Through the chair, yeah, it's a good point. We'll take it on board.
Thank you.
well, we'll put in the motion then that we amend the treaty partnership section to reflect those points. How's that?
Thank you,
What
Mr.
about the
Chairman.
Pacifica community? Can we put that in the
Well, I think
motion
that's
too?
covered, Mr. Chairman.
Oh,
It's covered. I think that's, well, I looked at that and I thought when Councillor Fletcher raised that, I think she raised a very good point. But I do think that's probably more, that is probably covered under social inclusion and equity.
Okay, we'll put that.
I'm not treating independent Māori statutory.
Yeah, no, I agree.
Councillor Cashmore.
Yes, thank you, Mr.
Council
Chair.
process.
Graham and Christine, well done. The birth of this Empowered Communities was not easy, and we know it took some local boards and some politicians had to be dragged kicking and screaming into the reality of actually the huge volume and worth of our volunteers in our areas and what they are worth to our communities and to us as a council. So thank you for that work. How has the assimilation of existing activities prior to the Empowered Communities, how are they assimilated in? That's my first question. Second one is, I see here we have some examples of new initiatives. Are we going to take those as some exemplars to go out to local boards and to regional councillors even to say these are some of the things that can be done as sparks for activity. And the last question, probably the most difficult, would be the extra 400k in savings. Are we expecting that difference can be picked up in the actual deliverables to our community via those communities' empowerments themselves?
Through the chair, so to answer your first question, I think when the unit went live, we had a work program that had been developed prior, and so there was a mixture of delivery because it needed to be done, and looking at where we could apply a more empowered communities approach. With the 16-17 work program, we've made an extensive effort to have that reflect an empowered communities approach. I don't think that we're 100% there, but I think we've made good progress. So that's my answer to that one. With the second question about the exemplars, yes, we are looking at a communication strategy that we can really highlight some of those, particularly some of the examples that cover, multiple local boards and things like that. So that's a piece of work in progress. And in terms of your last question, I think what we've got is quite a lot of legacy arrangements, and we need to look at all of those and look at how do we reflect an empowered communities approach. So how do we kind of be looking at the 5 key focus areas of the empowered communities approach and have that reflected in our regional funding.
Mr. Chair, just a very brief comment. This potential of the empowered communities approach is massive, and very early on in this term, we worked with the Chief Executive Officer and the Chief Operating Officer to deliver things like the Waiku mudlarks who'd been stalled down, and that's been a massive success. So with the right impetus and the right push, things can really move forward at great pace. So thank you for the work. Look forward to ongoing measurement of its success going forward.
Mr. McDonald.
Yes, I was just wanting to talk about homelessness, the projects that we've been sort of sticking funding into, whether it be the Auckland City Mission contract or the other housing contract. I guess what I'd be keen to see is, out of all of these things that we're doing, how many more people or how many homeless people are we housing? A couple of weeks ago I was watching this program, the Sunday program's Q&A, or what it was. They had a lovely panel of high flyers around how they could whip up prefab buildings overnight if they could just get rid of the bureaucratic red tape, that we had to free up some land, that we had to have iwi on board to drive this social housing stuff. And then they had in Skype Huri Dennis from Te Puia Marae, and all he said was, last week we housed 62 people. So that's what I'm looking for, all this energy, effort, money, networking, plans, all going into the top end of funding. How many more people are we, rough sleepers, homeless people are we housing out of this stuff?
Through the chair, so we are trying to work closely with providers and central government, because we see clearly that it's central government's responsibility to house homeless people, but obviously anything that we can do to support that space we want to do. I think Te Puia Marae is actually a great example of empowered communities in action, because they saw a need and they responded to it. So we have, with our colleagues in Te Waka Angamua, worked closely to ease that for them, to try and make that as easy as possible for them in terms of across council as well, in terms of looking at permitting and any resource that they've needed. So we were able to assist them financially to help that process. So our focus hasn't really been on actually counting numbers, because that's not, our focus has been more supporting providers. We've worked closely with Lifewise in particular, and City Mission and Salvation Army around how can we assist them to increase their capacity to, to actually do the doing.